All right, so we'll jump now directly into bumblebee conservation. We've touched on some of it, but we'll get a little bit more specific about some of the issues that are going on and try to focus it here in the Northwest. So I mentioned that we're only working on about 1.5% of North America's bees. So why are we spending so much of our resources trying to conserve this narrow group of animals? It's a fair question. One of the main reasons is that bumblebees are the charismatic microfauna of the world, right? So all of you are here to talk about bumblebees. They're cuddly, they look soft, they're familiar. People have written children's books and children's songs about bumblebees, and everybody sort of has a positive emotion associated with them. And as much as I don't want to admit it, that is important. You know, if I ask people to save cuckoo bees or to save sweat bees, different thoughts and emotions are elicited when we talk about that. So just having sort of the spokesperson for pollinators, we call bumblebees the gateway drug to pollinators. It gets people interested and engaged in a way that is not always easy for folks. Bees do sting. You can get sting, right? Everybody has been stung by a bee, or maybe not everybody. Most people have probably been stung by wasps, and they blame it on the bees. But you know, it's for obviously probably not for the people in this room, but for some people it's hard to talk about bees and saving bees. People have a hard time with that. And so just having an animal that's beautiful and that elicits positive responses means a lot. But in addition to that, bumblebees add a tremendous amount of value to the landscape, particularly here in the Northwest where it's cold and wet, or sometimes wet anyway. But so their physiology is really, really important. They have this really unique ability in the bee world to regulate their own body temperature. They can actually detach their wings from their flight muscles, and then they can vibrate those flight muscles and warm their bodies up. And so they're not entirely dependent on the external environment like most other insects to be able to warm up and fly. So they've been seen flying in the snow. This is a bumblebee visiting, I think, Oregon grape in the snow right here. So they can fly in really cold temperatures. So when most other bees are in their nest trying to stay warm, bumblebees are out there in the landscape moving throughout and pollinating. And especially in places where it's cold and wet and we need crops to pollinate, bumblebees are really important in those environments. They're also super intelligent in many ways that people don't associate with insects. I'm going to show you a video on the next slide that'll help you see a little bit about how intelligent they are. They also have really long tongues that allows them to access nectar from plants that have really long corolla tubes that most other bees wouldn't visit those plants. And then they're also innovative. They can be very robust and strong. This is a plant called bottle gentian. It's native to Eastern North America. And the corolla tube never opens up. The bumblebees have figured out how to stick their faces in there, and then they pry the corolla tube open, crawl in there and get their pollen and nectar and do the pollination, and then move on to the next one. It's an obligate relationship they have with bumblebees. And then they also do this really cool thing called buzz pollination. Most honeybees and a lot of native bees can't do this, but plants in the family Solanaceae, like tomatoes and peppers, the pollen is actually fused inside the anthers. It's not readily accessible. The only way to get it out is to actually vibrate the plant at a particular frequency. And most bees can't do that, but bumblebees can. They can land on a flower and then they vibrate their wings at a very particular frequency, and the pollen comes shooting out of the anthers. So maybe you can see it or maybe you can't, depending on where you're sitting in the room, but the pollen's literally just shooting out of that plant right there. And so it's something you can hear when you can hear bumblebees doing this. If you watch them on flowers, they sort of fly between flowers with that low bomber sound that they have, and then they get on the plant and you'll hear and that's what they're doing. They're vibrating the plant to get the pollen out a little bit easier. And a lot of native bees and honeybees can't do that. So this is a video that also just shows the intelligence of Bumblebees. Some researchers in the UK used bumblebees to sort of test their intelligence, and it's pretty incredible to see. So in this case, they're trying to use a sugar solution to basically train bumblebees to move balls in a laboratory. And so they have this ball, and this is the researcher sort of teaching the bumblebee that if I roll the ball into that circle, then nectar appears underneath that ball. And so they trained it for a little while, and you'll see here in a second that they learn how to do it pretty rapidly. So she can now just grab that ball and go, woohoo! She rolls the ball in there and realizes that when she does that, she's gonna get some sugar under there. So that's amazing in and of itself, but then you take that, and then actually bumblebees can learn from not just the researcher, but from other bumblebees, right? They're learning by watching other animals. So that bumblebee learned how to do that by watching another one, which is something we previously only associated with like octopuses, dolphins, and human beings, of learning from other animals. And then they're also can learn how to be very efficient. So in that case, that bumblebee learned how to choose the closest bumblebee to the closest ball to the reward instead of choosing the longer one. So some pretty high level intelligence that you wouldn't think of with a brain that's, a couple of millimeters in diameter. And because of their buzz pollination and the fact that they are abundant when it's cold and wet, means they're really important pollinators of these high value crops like tomatoes, peppers, blueberries, cranberries, clover, which means they feed a lot of cows, squash, and melon. And then this are a bunch of the plants that benefit from buzz pollination. Dodecatheon or shooting star is one of the plants that does benefit from buzz pollination. So that's sort of the value of bumblebees. And now we're going to take a look at their ecology a little bit. We're really, really lucky here in the Northwest, if you like bumblebees, because we are in the biodiversity hotspot of North American bumblebee diversity. So here in the Northwest, we have close to 25 or 26 species of bumblebees, while the rest of the country, middles with 11 to 20. So we've got a bunch of different species here because we have so many different environments, so many different habitat types, and they love these cool, wet climates and because we have the elevational topography, it just creates a lot of different opportunities. There are 47 species in North America. Most of them are social colonies that are founded by a single queen. The colonies, unlike honeybees, they only last a single year. So after the year, the new queens that have just reproduced or just mated are the only ones that will survive the winter. The rest of the colony dies off. Nests can have anywhere from 25 to well over 500 individual or workers in them. And then, as I mentioned earlier, their nests are in abandoned rodent burrows, rock walls, brush piles, and other places like that. The size of the nest varies between species, but then also between different habitat types. You might get a species of bumblebee that lives at sea level that has 500 workers in it, and the same species might also live at 6,500 feet, and it might only have 25 people or workers in that nest because there aren't as many resources available and the season is shorter. So just to go over the life cycle in a little bit more detail, in the spring, which is now or previous to now, the queens emerge from hibernation and they fly around looking for a nest site. A lot of you have probably seen this behavior. If you see a queen bumblebee, which are the big bumblebees that you see early in the year, and they're flying low around the ground, and they stop and they walk and they go into a hole and they come back out of the hole and they fly around, and they can spend 2 to 3 weeks looking for a nest site sometimes. Once they've found that nest site, they build some waxen pots in there, and they fill it with pollen and nectar, and then they lay their eggs on it. And then once they've laid those eggs on the pollen, the larvae emerge, they eat the pollen, they pupate, and then they emerge as winged adults, and those are the workers. And once the workers are out, the queen stays in the nest. She just continues laying eggs and tending to her young and feeding them, and the workers are the ones that are out bringing more pollen back into the nest. question. Yeah.
So can you tell like how much time elapses between egg and larva pupae?
Yeah, it's about 5 weeks from egg to adult, which is I often get a lot of questions like in late March or so, sometimes later than that, where people were like, weeks ago I saw all these bumblebees and now they're gone and I don't know what happened. And usually that's probably the time where the queen is in there incubating, and then a couple weeks later the workers emerge and all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, the bumblebees are back. And I think that's usually that intermittent time period where people get confused. Yes?
So she keeps laying eggs, so you could have bees emerging every week.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah, which is why the colony slowly gets bigger over the course of the summer. And also, because there's now workers bringing more resources into the nest, you'll notice that the workers, as the season go on, also get bigger because those workers are actually getting more food in their development process. So the workers also get bigger as the season goes on. Then towards the end of the summer, there are enough resources in the nest that the queen starts producing the reproductive members of the colony. So those are going to be the queens and the males. Interesting aside, of the genetics of the Hymenoptera, of the bees, is very different than us, right? Our gender is determined what we have at sort of the chromosome 23. If we have two X's, we're traditionally defined as a female. If we have an X and a Y, we're traditionally defined as a male, and that determines our gender identity. It's very different with bees. They exhibit what we call haplodiploidy, which means if they have a single copy of the genome, they're a male, and if they have two copies of the genome, they're a female. So if a queen lays an egg and she doesn't fertilize it with sperm, it develops into a male. If she fertilizes the egg, it develops into a female. This is a very different way, but she has full control over whether she's laying males or females because of that. An interesting conservation aside to that is if she mates with a male that's closely related to her, so that the two copies of the genome are pretty close to identical, like if it was her brother, then all of her offspring would actually develop into males because the two copies of the genome would be so similar. I know that's kind of complicated for those of you that maybe don't fully understand genetics, but what that means is that as bumblebee populations get smaller and smaller and you're more likely to mate with related individuals, you can end up in what's called an extinction spiral pretty quickly and get into really quick inbreeding depression. Question?
Yeah, just kind of go back, you may have said this. So the female, like queen, is then living most of the season and producing eggs.
Yeah.
What about the workers? Do they have an equal longevity? Does the hive just continue to grow? Or? It
does continue to grow. I think so a queen lives basically for 1 full year. And the workers, I bet their lifespan's closer to 3 or 4 weeks. And predation's part of that. They work themselves to death is probably also part of that. But yeah, I think they probably live closer to 3 or 4 weeks or so. And interestingly enough, the workers, they can also lay eggs, right? They haven't mated, so the eggs that they lay will develop into males. But the queen doesn't want them to do that because those males are actually less related to her. At least that's the genetic explanation for it. So she also has to control her workers and make sure they're not laying eggs in the nest. But some of them inevitably do, and that's why you start to see some early season males sometimes. There's all kinds of different, interesting biology going on when you have 500 individuals living in a room, all with a little bit of their own personality. Was there another question?
Well, when once the workers start laying eggs, once there's a crew of workers and the queen is laying eggs and producing these cohorts of workers, how long does it take to go from egg to adult workers?
It's about 5 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe you can get, okay. But the queen might be laying those eggs fairly just regularly then.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think especially once workers are bringing resources in, she's laying eggs every day, and so you get probably new individuals and it's an exponential growth. So they're growing pretty rapidly by the end of the season. And as an aside, some people have wondered why we haven't started sampling for bumblebees sort of yet. As Ross mentioned, they're out in the landscape. We're asking folks in this project to wait until June, and that's because we really want to have an abundant, we want the workers to be out so that you're more likely to encounter these animals. It's harder to encounter queens just because there aren't as many of them out there. And so that's why we're asking folks to wait until June to do this. So then in the fall, the queens that have newly been produced by the foundress queen, they come out and they forage for pollen and nectar to eat, to fatten themselves up, to build up resources to make it through the winter. And then they also will try to find a mate, and they can mate with multiple males. It's not necessarily just a single male that they mate with. And then once the colony is complete, the foundress queen dies, all of the workers die. Once the males leave the nest, they never really come back to it. So you'll often in the fall see males sleeping on flowers or on the underside of leaves. They don't come back to the nest. Their really only purpose is to mate. And so an interesting aside to that is male bumblebees can't sting either because they don't. The stinger is actually the ovipositor. So once you learn how to identify a male, you can hold those bees in your hand and amaze your friends at parties. Yeah, and then once the colony is sort of over, the newly mated queens or the new queens, some of them probably don't actually mate and still hibernate, but they find a hibernacula. We don't know a lot about these hibernacula. I feel like it's an area ripe for investigation, but they seem to be what we do know about them is they're sort of shallow holes, a couple inches or an inch under the ground, or sometimes under pine needles or leaf litter or things like that. And then they spend the winter and then start again the following spring. And that this is just sort of what it looks like through the year. Sort of spring over here and then fall over here. As the resources grow, so does the colony, and then we mate and then hibernate again. And you all have this image. There's a brochure in your packets there that has this image with some more detail on it. Yes?
Rich, I had a quick question back to the slide about their hibernacula.
Yeah.
How early in the year do they go into hibernacula?
That's a great question, and it's species dependent. So some species. Yeah, I will repeat the question. Thank you. The question was, how early in the season will queens be entering into their hibernacula? And so some species, the species that emerges earliest in the Northwest is called Bombus melanopygus or melanopagus, depending on who you talk to. Its common name is the black-tailed bumblebee. It's out in February, or at least in areas that aren't under snow. It's out in February. And its life cycle is complete by June, or by towards the end of June, you'll see new queens, and then those queens will be entering hibernation shortly thereafter. Whereas species like Morrison's bumblebee and Nevada bumblebee, like they're just coming out in early June or late May. And so their life cycle isn't going to be over until September. So it's somewhat species dependent when they'll be going into that hibernacula.
Well, the reason I asked is because for the ones that are under the leaf litter, I'm just wondering, like in prescribed fire programs and things like that, how many?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. And so can I borrow your packet real quick?
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that we provided you guys with a ton of resources in here. One of the resources in here is called Conserving Bumblebees. And this actually was written largely for land managers, although it's appropriate for showing it to the people online. It's also appropriate for homeowners, but this talks about how the life cycle interacts with land management and talks about all of those issues, even raking leaves. Like raking leaves, we really encourage people not to rake leaves in the fall. We started a new Leave the Leaves campaign this past fall where we really ask people if you need, those leaves are great. They compost and they help your lawn and your garden. There's no reason to remove them at all. But if you need to remove them, waiting until you see bumblebees in the spring is the best thing to do. So thanks for asking that question. It's a good one. if I didn't repeat it, the question was, you know, how does then land management interact with these hibernacula? Could we be disturbing bumblebees with fire and other land management opportunities? Okay, done here, done there. And so, this is what, bumblebees, as we start to think about bumblebee conservation and what the landscape looks like, these sort of messy areas are really important. But then as we start jumping back a little bit and thinking about what the landscape, the larger landscape, needs to look like, we need opportunities for populations that are living here to be able to find populations that are living miles away. And so creating corridors and other things at a landscape scale is something that we as land managers need to be thinking about as we sort of step up the landscape and start looking at a larger scale. How do we manage not just at the local level, talking about putting flowers and nesting resources in, but how do we create a larger landscape that also is contributing to a larger conservation effort? Interestingly enough, too, I mentioned some cuckoo bees earlier. Bumblebees also have cuckoos. So actually one of the SGCN bumblebees in Idaho is the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee. And they have a really unique life cycle that's actually different than the other bumblebees. They emerge a little bit later, and they don't found their own nests. They actually invade the nests of other bumblebees. So they crawl into established nests, and they either kill or kick the founder's queen out. And then they use the worker caste that she's developed to produce all of her offspring. So all of the offspring that the cuckoo bumblebee lays are reproductive members. She doesn't have any workers at all. She's dependent on the foundress bumblebee colony to do all of the work for her. And so these guys actually don't have curbicula. They don't collect pollen at all. And so they have this really sort of tough balance. They have to invade a nest late enough so that there is a worker caste, but not so late that the worker caste is big enough to actually fight off and kick the invading cuckoo bumblebee in there. So it's a really delicate balance that goes in there. Interestingly enough, these guys are often species dependent in terms of their host. So cuckoo bumblebees are often dependent on a very specific species of bumblebee in which to build their nest. Suckly's cuckoo bumblebee is dependent on the western bumblebee to build its nest. And if you remember, the western bumblebee is in pretty dramatic decline. And so it's no surprise that its cuckoo bumblebee is also in pretty dramatic decline. And some people then often ask the question, well, shouldn't we just get rid of the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee if it's invading the nest of the western bumblebee? And that's a fair question and an interesting sort of biological question. From my perspective, it's more of like a predator-prey relationship, right? Probably the invading of the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee probably helps eventually strengthen the genetic stock of the western bumblebee. It's probably just a natural part of the ecology. And I'm not suggesting that we should start playing God by removing one of those ecological factors that are out there. I don't think we fully understand. Were there a couple questions? I thought I saw some hands.
Well, you pretty much answered it, but our challenge, in the department, and because they're both species of greatest conservation need, how do we balance their conservation needs?
Yeah. I think really the idea is that I think the factors are the same, really. If you're conserving habitat for the western bumblebee, you're conserving the Suckly cuckoo bumblebee is ultimately how to answer that question, I think. All right. So I mentioned earlier that a quarter of the bumblebees in North America are facing some degree of extinction risk. I'm just going to share with you a little bit more information about that as we learn a little bit more about the status of our native bumblebees. Yes, Ross.
I have an online question for you. So Michael asked, what is the range of bumblebees and will they move higher in elevation as snow melts and more resources become available?
Okay, the question is, what is the range of bumblebees and will they move higher in elevation as more resources become available? The range of bumblebees, an individual colony, I assume, is the question. What is the range of an individual colony? They practice sort of resource economics, right? They're gonna practice what we call optimal foraging theory, which means they're gonna forage as close to their nest as they possibly can, so that all of the calories that they take in go towards the production of offspring and not towards flying really long distances. That said, bumblebees can fly pretty far. I think they probably regularly forage within about a mile of their nest is probably a pretty good guess. They can fly probably up to 6 to 10 miles. There's been some studies. There's a really cool study that's been done by this guy by the name of Dave Goulson, who's a researcher in the United Kingdom. And he has colonies that he keeps in his office. And so he was curious about this question at some point too. And so he started taking individuals out of his sort of captive colony, and he marked them, and then he would drive a distance from his office in his car, and then he would release the bumblebee and then go back to his office as fast as he could and sort of wait for that marked bumblebee to return. And I don't remember the specific distances, but within about 5 kilometers, it was pretty much 100% return, and most of them would beat him back to the office. Once you get further than that, out into sort of the 5 to 10 mile or 5 to 10 kilometer range, return rates decreased sort of as you might expect. The further they were, the less likely they were to find their nest. And so what that means is that bumblebees probably recognize features on the landscape within about 5 kilometers of their nest. So if that higher elevation terrain is accessible within 5 kilometers, then I would say yes, they would move to higher elevation as snow melts and as more resources become available. But they are nest centered, so their whole nest isn't going to move. Like, they don't have an opportunity like a honeybee colony does to swarm and to move to a different location. They are nest centered, so their whole colony isn't going to move to higher elevation, if that was part of the question. Yes?
So as a follow-up, what's the highest elevation you might find a nest?
What's the highest elevation you would find a nest? There's actually some researchers that are working on sort of what's the highest elevation that bumblebees can fly at, and they can fly above Mount Everest. So they can fly in really low air density, above 30,000 feet. But that would be the highest elevation where you find nests would be the highest elevation you'd find wildflowers. Yeah. That are blooming for 5 weeks, right? At least 5 weeks or a little bit longer than that, so they can actually produce queens. So pretty high, well above tree line for sure. And we actually have a few species in the Northwest that are really high elevation dependent. They only live at like really high elevations. And so this bumblebee conservation story started in the mid-1990s. There's a gentleman by the name of Robin Thorpe, who is a professor emeritus at UC Davis. And he sort of raised the red flag about bumblebee decline in the mid-1990s. He was studying some sites down near Mount Shasta and Mount Ashland in Southern Oregon, Northern California. And he noticed 2 species, Franklin's bumblebee, who we've already talked about, and the western bumblebee, who we've already talked about, disappearing from his survey sites. And and it was a rapid crash, like over the course of just a couple of years. And sort of raised the red flag and said, hey, does anybody else notice bumblebee decline? And sure enough, 2 species in the east, the yellow-banded bumblebee and the rusty-patched bumblebee, had also gone through pretty precipitous and rapid declines in eastern North America. But at the same time, there were other species that seemed to be doing just fine. And an interesting biology story here is that these 4 species are within the group of bumblebees that are native to North America. These 4 are really closely related. They're sister species to each other. And these were the only ones that seemed to be going through these declines, which raises an interesting question from a conservation perspective. Like, if some bumblebees are in decline, why aren't all bumblebees in decline, right? If there's some factor in the landscape that's causing bumblebees to decline, why aren't we seeing it in all species? Well, there must be something unique about the genetic makeup of these species that were leading to some rapid decline, which has led to some of the hypotheses that we're going to talk about. And I'll try to weave that in as we go through the threats that are on the landscape. But the founding of those 4 species and their decline led to this formation of the Bumblebee Specialist Group that I mentioned earlier. This is a network of scientists all over the globe that are working to assess the extinction risk of bumblebees. And so here in North America, we used a large specimen database to assess sort of historic presence versus current presence and look at to see which species that had been in decline. And so right now, I just want to take a minute to talk about museum specimens, right? So we have a lot of people are really weary about killing animals to study them. We're not asking you to do that in this project. We're asking you to take photographs of them, and that's how we're going to document what lives where. But we wouldn't know what we know about the status of animals without these museum collections of bumblebees. There is tremendous value to these collections and having these animals on a pin somewhere so that they can be studied. If you're interested, I think Ross is interested in having people that are willing to actually collect physical specimens, just because that helps us study the animals. If 20 years in the future, somebody is interested in the bumblebee that you saw on some mountain in Idaho, you can only tell so much from a photo. You can tell a lot more from a physical specimen. So all I'm trying to say is there's tremendous value in collecting some of these animals. Obviously, we don't want to over-collect, but there is value to it in my personal conservation biologist opinion, and a lot of people agree with me. And so if you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out to either Ross or myself, and we can help you find some of those resources to do that work as well. That would sort of be well above and beyond what we're asking folks to do, but if you're interested, we're interested too. And so we used these museum records, and that allowed us to look all the way back to the early 1800s to see, which species were living where at that time. And we were able to sort of draw range maps for the historic versus the current. And you can see here for the western bumblebee, its range, especially along the western part of its area in the southern portion, has declined pretty rapidly. So we were able to actually measure its decline and came up with an overall change of around 30% for this species, and it was listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. Similarly for Bombus morrisoni, another species of greatest conservation need, this species had declined by almost 60%, again, mostly along the edges of its range. And this species was also listed as vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. This is Bombus sucklei. It has declined by 83%, so really rapid decline for this species. It's only known from, I think, 7 locations over the last 15 years or so. So this is a species we're particularly worried about, and this is listed as critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. But there are other species that are doing just fine. You guys don't have this species here in Idaho, but in Oregon and Washington, California, Bombus vosnesenskii seems to be thriving. I talked earlier about Bombus affinis, which has gone through declines in the east. And then there's some species that are sort of continent-wide, like the yellow-banded Bombus terricola, also in decline. And eventually it makes this pie chart that I've now showed you 3 times, which is probably too many. But nevertheless, we have 4 animals that are critically endangered, 2 that are endangered, 5 that are vulnerable, and 1 that is near threatened. And so what are these threats? So I guess what we learned from that IUCN study is it's not just those 4 species that are in decline. It's more than that. So it's not just those closely related species, but others. But clearly still not all bumblebees are experiencing declines. And so there must be some biological differences or other things that are leading to some being successful while others are struggling. And so what might that be? As with colony collapse disorder and
I hope it holds up.
I do too. This is another, there's no smoking gun. There's no one thing that's leading to bumblebee decline. The use of pesticides, decreasing food supply through habitat loss, genetics, all sorts of other things are leading to the decline of the bumblebee. And so, just fixing, it's not going to be a simple fix for us to change this or to fix what's going on. But one of the major factors out there is habitat loss. We've taken landscapes that once looked like this, that provided flowering resources from early spring through late fall, perfect habitat for bumblebees, and we've plowed them under, and we now plant a crop that blooms for maybe 2 weeks in there. So something that used to provide flowering resources now only provides flower resources for 2 weeks. And even more recently, we've taken some of these edge habitats on the edge outsides of cities, and as we expand and the human population builds, building houses also takes habitat away, especially if this is just replaced with a green sort of turf grass lawn, right? That takes resources away as well. Another major factor, and you'll notice this is right around the same time as those bumblebees started to see declines in the mid-1990s. This is when neonicotinoids were introduced into basically the mainstream use for agriculture and home use. How many of you heard the term neonicotinoid? Oh, everybody. All right, good. I don't need to tell you that much about it then. But one of the interesting things about neonicotinoids is that they are a systemic insecticide, which means that when you apply it to a plant, it's actually absorbed by the plant and expressed in all of the tissues. So in addition to being in the leaves, it's also in the pollen and in the nectar. So anytime a bee visits a plant that's been treated with a neonicotinoid, it's getting a micro dose of that insecticide. It's often not a lethal dose, it's what we call a sublethal dose. But there are significant sublethal effects every time a bumblebee visits, and if the whole colony is doing that, over time you get this decreased fecundity or decreased reproductive rates, and then over time that can also lead to declines. But this is what usage looked like, and this is only agricultural usage. This is what agricultural usage looked like in 1994. Just 5 years later, in 1999, it took off in the agricultural sector, and then again 2004. We just get darker and darker as we go to 2009, 2010. That's sort of the most recent good data that we have. And this is just one of the 4 highly toxic neonicotinoids that are on the market. It's certainly the most abundant one, imidacloprid, but there are 3 others that are also being used on different crops and in different regions. So this is obviously a landscape scale effect. We're not just talking about something local. Yes?
Can you tell me why Wyoming, Colorado, and some of the other areas you talk about are all so, is it because there's less agricultural?
Yeah, less agricultural usage, or so it's just that the crops that they're growing there at that time have not been adopted by that. That doesn't mean that one of the 3 other products that are being used hasn't been adopted by whatever crop that they're growing in those areas.
So what kind of crops are they applied to?
The main crops is corn and soybeans. I think 96% of the corn and soybean that's produced in the United States is treated with neonicotinoids. And, because they're systemic, it means that these chemicals are water soluble. So anytime any of this chemical gets on the ground, it moves into the groundwater and it moves immediately everywhere. So into streams and through the water table, and has been found in pollen residues really far away from agricultural crops. So, it's moving through the landscape both as dust and, through the water pretty rapidly. That said, when most people think about agricultural crops, they usually, when most people think about agricultural crops, good. When most people think about pesticides, they do jump right to agriculture and they start thinking about, oh, it's the farmers or this. And that's true. There are problems with how agriculture is created. But at the same time, farmers have an economic incentive to use the least amount of insecticides that they can to be effective, right? They have that incentive because they're trying to make money. Homeowners don't have that same economic incentive. They want their problem solved. They want to have pretty roses or whatever. And so oftentimes when they apply products, they are applying them at much higher rates and much higher concentrations and much more frequently than they are in the agricultural sector. To apply these pesticides on a farm, you need to have a license. You need to have taken a class. You don't need to take a class to go to Home Depot and get basically the same product off the shelf and apply it. And a lot of maintenance companies that are taking care of lawns, they're using these products regularly. And there was an example in Portland in 2014 where a maintenance company was taking care of these linden trees in a parking lot. And the linden trees were blooming. And I don't know if any of you know what a linden tree looks like, but when it's blooming, you can hear the tree from 100 meters away. Like literally there are thousands of bees on it. And but it also attracts aphids. So aphids are small little plant pests that secrete honeydew. And that honeydew can drip onto the ground. And obviously if you park your car in this spot right here, because it's in the shade, you're gonna get honeydew on your car. People don't like to have sugar water in their car because it's really hard to get off. That's sarcasm. So they came in and they sprayed 62 linden trees in this parking lot with a highly toxic insecticide. And all of those black dots that you see in that parking lot, those are dead bumblebees that were literally raining out of the trees and falling on the ground. And if you take a look at that area right there, that's a photo from that area. So those are all dead bumblebees. And as you zoom in, you start to see the density of dead bumblebees that were covered across this parking lot. There were well over 100,000 dead bumblebees, from these trees that had been sprayed for basically no reason whatsoever, right? Aphids were not going to harm the plant. People were just nervous about getting sugar water on their car, basically, was the reason that this was done. And the interesting thing that happens here is that if this happens in a grassy field somewhere, no one ever knows about it, right? Because those dead bumblebees just end up in the ground and no one ever sees them. So this happened here, and it actually has raised awareness. And now, the Oregon Department of Agriculture has regulated how these products are used much better than had been done historically. But this is going on all over the country. This is happening in urban areas all over the country. And in fact, when we look at residues in water systems, we find higher concentrations in urban and suburban areas than we do in agricultural areas. So these products are being used as much, if not more, in urban areas than they are out in the agricultural sector. So it sounds like you're all probably very well aware of this, but we need to do a better job of talking to our neighbors. Because in my opinion, and this is a little bit of a soapbox, I suppose, but I don't think there's any reason to use this toxic of a chemical in an ornamental setting. I just don't think it works. We need to change our definition of what pretty is, and pretty needs to be functional. And functional is not, highly toxic insecticides are not part of that functional landscape. And the other thing about these chemicals that you probably also already know is that they're long-lived. After a single application, they can be expressed up to 7 years later. Right, so these linden trees are still expressing insecticides 7 years after a single application. So that's a long-term effect. And if you're a homeowner, you spray every year. So then you're just getting this increase in concentration in the nectar. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. I think I'm going to stop talking about insecticides now, but it is a really important issue. Yeah.
So was this a neo?
Yes.
Neonic?
Yeah,
you can purchase it at
yes.
whatever store.
Safari is the brand name of what was used here, and dinitiforin is the active ingredient. Yeah.
So you find these on shelves at hardware stores.
Pretty much anything you find at Home Depot, or I don't know where you guys shop around here, but almost every product on its Lowe's, almost every product on the shelf is going to be a systemic. If it says systemic on it, it's one of these chemicals. Yeah. And there's like 7 or 8 of them, to be fair, and 4 of them are highly toxic to bees. I don't know if I put the pamphlet in here. Let's see if I did, and it's available on our website. We have a pamphlet that's called Protecting Bees from Neonicotinoids in Your Garden. that lists all of the active ingredients. I didn't put it in your packets. But it's available on the Xerces website, where it actually lists the active ingredient and it lists some of the common names that you would find as well. All right. Climate change is also another factor. One of the questions from online earlier was about, are bumblebees going to move further north as snow melts? I assume that question was in relation to a single season. But between seasons, as we start to look at climate change, the reality is our snowpacks, particularly at lower elevations, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which means that meadows are melting out earlier, and they're also drying out earlier. And so that's causing a lot of shifts in bumblebees and in the phenology of plants and other animals that depend on them. And so one of the things we are seeing is that bumblebees do seem to be moving generally higher in elevation. But there's a limit to how high you can go in elevation because mountains end, right? They can't go up into space. There's no flowers up there. So that is a threat. But the other interesting threat that's going on, particularly with bumblebees, with most species that have been studied, it seems like they're migrating north as the climate warms. They're moving to sort of their more comfortable temperature range. But bumblebees aren't doing that. And they're not doing that in Europe, and they're not doing that in North America. And we don't know why. They don't seem to be responding to that northward shift. And to be fair, it could be a data issue. It could be we just don't know that they are moving northward. We don't have the correct data to answer that question. But we've seen it in butterflies, we've seen it in birds, we've seen it in plants and trees. We see this northward migration. We haven't seen it yet in bumblebees. And so what the word out there in the street is that bumblebees are stuck in a climate vise. So they seem to have a northern limit, and they're being pressured from the south. So their habitat's just getting smaller and smaller because of climate change. I do think we need more data here, but this is an interesting paper that was published in Science a couple years ago. Another interesting factor, and this is related to those 4 species that I mentioned at the beginning of this sort of threats area, is there's this, in addition to all these other factors, there is a commercial bumblebee industry. Because bumblebees are such great buzz pollinators, the tomato industry has realized that when they have tomatoes or when they have bumblebees in greenhouses, that their fruit production grows rapidly. So in response to that, companies have started commercializing and selling boxes of bumblebees. If you're a farmer or even a homeowner, you can go online and order a box of bumblebees and have that shipped to your house. You could put it in your garden, or you could put it in your greenhouse, which on the surface seems great, right? We're increasing pollination services, we are increasing fruit production, we're helping farmers. Unfortunately, what has happened is if you start growing animals that are normally on the landscape in a laboratory at super high density, you're going to introduce diseases, right? And so what happened in these laboratories, or what we believe happened in these laboratories, is they built up a resistance to a really unique disease called Nosema bombi. And then when those commercial bumblebees were shipped all over North America, those commercial bumblebees were then escaping from greenhouses or being used in the open and actually interacting with wild bumblebees on flowers, and they spread that disease to our native bumblebees. And we believe that those 4 species I talked about before, the rusty patch bumblebee, the yellow-banded bumblebee, the western bumblebee, and Franklin's bumblebee, were all highly susceptible to this Nosema pathogen. And this is a horrible analogy to use, but it's not terribly different from us handing smallpox blankets to Native Americans, right? The native wild bumblebees didn't have the resistance and went through a really rapid population crash. And the timing of all this sort of goes with the boom of the commercial bumblebee industry. So that's another big threat out there. Interestingly enough, this is a completely unregulated industry. So we're not monitoring or not regulating which species are shipped where. So if you live in Idaho and you have a greenhouse and you want to grow tomatoes in there and you want to buy bumblebees, the only bumblebee that you can currently buy isn't even native to Idaho. It's only native east of the Rockies. So in addition to the disease issue, we're also moving non-native species all over the country. And they're not being tested for diseases or anything. They're just going about their business. And, you know, I think the industry hopefully understands that it's in their best interest to clean this up, and I think they are taking appropriate steps, but they're fighting any effort to have it regulated at a national level. And so, great, there's our nadir of the presentation. Now we can start talking about how do we uplift ourselves and what conservation efforts can we do to counteract everything that's going on out there. I think there is a lot that we can do. I don't think we need to be totally depressed. And as I mentioned before, I think there is something, one of the great things about pollinator conservation is there is something that we can do about it. So what am I doing as a conservation biologist that gets paid full time to work on this? One of the things I did is write this book called Conserving Bumblebees that I told you about, and we've shared this with land managers all over the country, including, this was distributed to every single Forest Service region in the country, and it's obviously been shared at many of our workshops. So we're sharing a lot of information like this with people, trying to make it available and accessible. I also do some advocacy. I was an author on the petition to have the rusty patch bumblebee listed as an endangered species because I felt the science warranted it. So I helped to write that and continue to advocate to have the Fish and Wildlife Service do the review diligently, and they did, and they used the best available science and agreed that the species was indeed endangered, and now it's added to the endangered species list. And I think it was native once to 31 states. So that's going to change how pesticides are used in those 31 states. It's going to change how land change. You know, if you want to do a project, you have to think about rusty patch bumblebee habitat now, whether that be building a house, building a road, or building a new business, right? And so all of these new things, you know, bumblebees now have to be considered when people are doing projects in a lot of the East, which, you know, I'm sure industry doesn't love that side of it, but, you know, in some ways it's industry that got us into this mess, so they need to help us get out of it too by following these new regulations that are on the ground. It also means, and this is an interesting thing so I have parallel efforts that are going on in like the Eastern United States and Maine and in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And because of take, so take is a Section 9 section of the Endangered Species Act, it means that you can't capture, harm, or do anything with endangered species. It also means now it's harder for researchers to research these populations, because if I asked you all in the Eastern United States to go out and capture a bumblebee and put it in a vial, you couldn't do that with a rusty patch bumblebee, or you'd be violating the Endangered Species Act. So it also brings up interesting factors like that have changed now how we have to do research in those parts of the country. And this is the former range of the rusty patched bumblebee. I've also launched this great project called the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas that you all are aware of. And I'm so glad that you're here to help us with it. And as part of this, before I launched the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, we launched this website, Bumblebee Watch, where we encouraged folks to go out and take a picture of a bee on a flower. And then you can upload that photo to Bumblebee Watch. And we have an interactive identification guide where you can look at your bee and select the features that you see on the head, thorax, and abdomen of that bee, and then select a species. And we have a team of volunteers that have signed, or of bumblebee experts that have signed up all over the country to then go in and look at all of those submissions and try to verify them as that species, or change the species name on them if we need to. This has been a really wildly successful project. We've had, in the 4 years that we've been going, we've had more than 25,000 records submitted to Bumblebee Watch. And so the only problem that we've had is keeping up with the submissions, of trying to give people feedback in real time has been the hardest part of the project. And I'll admit that we just don't have the capacity. We're trying the best that we can. One of the great things about this particular project is I don't have funding to go in and do this, right? So when I do this, it's often at night, or you know, I'm basically volunteering when I verify these. But for this particular project, I have funding to do this, right? So you all are going to get feedback pretty rapidly. I'll be able to go into Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and give you guys feedback as quickly as we possibly can to keep those rolling, which is great. And then, you know, we start working on people we're teaching classes about how to improve habitat, whether that be urban habitat or talking with the Forest Service or the state of Idaho about how to better manage land, about how to create food sources from spring through fall, to create places to build a nest and to overwinter, to create that connectivity I was talking about earlier, and then how to reduce the use of pesticides. A lot of education that we do with folks. And so, you know, the nest sites generally at home, this is going to be your excuse to be lazy in your yard, creates nesting habitat. But we also want to think about those overwintering bumblebees, the question earlier about land management, but also in your home garden, you know, leaving those leaves on the ground, leaving some bare ground. All of those things are really important to allow bumblebees to do the entire life cycle. It's not just when they're above the ground that we need to think about them. Another question that often comes up, I think, and this is a touchy subject, so I'm going to try to do a dance here for a minute. So honeybees are really important, right? Our agricultural system as we know it right now is pretty much dependent on honeybees. We couldn't do it without them. We couldn't have the food that we have without them. But I think because honeybees have been in decline, there's been enough mention in the press, enough work in the press, that people somehow think that becoming a beekeeper is a solution to the problem, right? That keeping honeybees is a solution to the problem. The reality is in each one of those boxes of bees there are 10,000 to 50,000 mouths to feed, right? I already told you that habitat was limited in North America, and that urban areas are just as limited, if not more, than other areas. So becoming a backyard beekeeper is not conservation. Basically, you're introducing a whole new group of competitors to our native bees that are already struggling to find food. In addition to that, honeybees also carry diseases, and we know that they're also transferring those diseases to our native bees. I'm not telling you that you shouldn't be a beekeeper. If you are a beekeeper, you should go on being a beekeeper, but do it for the right reasons. Do it because you want to learn from a beautiful social animal that can teach you all kinds of incredible things, and because you like honey. But it's not conservation. Keeping bees for bee conservation is like keeping chickens for bird conservation, right? We don't do that. We put bird feeders out. We put habitat out for birds. We create habitat structure for birds. We don't keep chickens for bird conservation, right? So I'm not saying don't be a beekeeper. I'm saying do it for the right reasons. What we're encouraging people to do at Xerces is to create habitat. And if you create habitat, you're going to support all of the honeybees that are already in the landscape, and you're going to support all of our native bees. And so that's really, I think if you're really interested in conservation, that's what you should be focusing your efforts on. We don't need to move bees around the world. If we create habitat, they will come to us. So that is, that's all I got for that module. And I'm happy to take any questions. Yeah.
For a while, and maybe still, people were making, not a bee box, but a hotel.
Insect hotel?
Bee hotels.
Yeah.
Right? And then there was an issue with keeping them clean and how so would you suggest that's a good idea or a bad idea, or just create the habitat by leaving your food pile?
I think there's value to bee hotels. As long as you're not buying, like a lot of those bee hotels actually come with bees, right? And there's no reason to do that. If you put out you can just take a log and drill holes in it, and they will show up and use that. And that's great, you know? But, you know, in reality, there are those sort of mason bee nests is what you're talking about. There's enough value in just having them in your yard because somebody's going to ask you about them, and then you can tell them about them and have the conversation, right? So just that education piece, I think, probably provides enough value, even if it's not the best habitat in the world. The disease issue, the cleaning them, I do think is important. I think if you're gonna, you know, they don't normally nest in that high of a density. It's like the bumblebee issue, right? If you put them all in that location, they're gonna share diseases with each other. And particularly if you're moving bees from Canada or other places, like we're gonna end up with another disease issue. And so if you are gonna put these out in that density, there are some clear recommendations that we have about how to clean them or just completely replace them every year or every couple of years. It's not just a set it out and forget about it kind of situation. It does require, maintenance. Yeah. I need to do a better job about repeating the question. That question was about whether or not people should be putting sort of insect hotels or mason bee houses in their gardens as part of habitat.
So, do you guys do any work on the impacts of grazing, since cows have a tendency to eat flowers as well as grass?
Yep. The question is, do we do any work on grazing? That's actually what I studied in graduate school. I did a study in the Eastern Sierra of California of the effects of grazing of sheep versus cows versus no grazers. And yeah, sure enough, cattle and other and sheep are actually the worst by far, have a really dramatic effect by removing flower resources. That said, the way that we currently manage our land, the number of disturbance features on the land are gone, right? So we don't allow much fire anymore. A lot of our natural disturbance mechanisms are gone. And so cows, in some cases, or sheep, can be the only disturbance mechanism that are keeping the meadow habitats that we have left, right? If you look at aerial photographs from the early 1900s versus now, we've lost like 60% of our meadows and the connections between those meadows. So cows, while they can be destructive, if used appropriately and put on the landscape in the right density, they can be a really important disturbance mechanism for maintaining those early cereal habitats and flowers on the landscape. The problem is I think we're in a situation where sort of there's a institutional inertia out there where we just have too many animals on the landscape in too small of an area, and they're not monitored and moved enough. And so some of these grazing mechanisms are being introduced, or as they come up for reintroduction or renewal, we're encouraging people to write new grazing regulations into their grazing plans. And we actually just wrote, it's actually coming out later this month, early June. We just wrote BMPs for rangelands in the West for pollinators. And it's going to be co-produced with the Forest Service, and it'll be out in June. So keep your eye out for that. It talks about all of these issues.
Will that be on your website?
Yes.
Yeah, one thing about cattle is cattle prefer grass over flowers almost all the time.
They really like flowers.
They really like grass too, but you can use, it is possible. I'm not arguing cows are good or bad, but cows often, if they're like in a rotational grazing system, they can actually increase the amount of flowers on the landscape by decreasing grasses that compete with them. And then in some cases also, if cattle make kind of compacted areas, there's some evidence that the mason bees can use those areas for ground. Some of the ground nesting bees like compacted bare soil for nesting. So, again, it comes down to it's not necessarily cows are good or bad, but the management of it. I'm sure that's what you're.
Yeah, it requires active management, right? Cows you can't just set them in an area and let them be there. They're going to hang out in the wettest areas, and they're going to hammer those wet areas that are super important. But if we're moving them through the landscape, and actively managing them, they can be a really effective management tool. It's just doing it correctly, I think. And that does mean that it becomes more expensive, right? It means we need to spend more of our resources actually managing what's out there. So, any online questions, Ross? All right.
I've been covering over the back.
Oh, all right. We get to miss that. Any highlights to share?
There was one question when you were talking about burning. So when you're talking about habitat, if people are managing landscapes and they're burning, what's kind of the best time of year? Is there a bad time of year to be implementing fire treatments, spring, fall, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the best time of year to burn is probably as late in the season as you can. Winter or late fall burning is the best time of year to burn. But the hard part about being a land manager is that's managing for bumblebees, right? There's other species out there for which that might not be the best time to burn. And so figuring out multi-species management is no small task.
Do they survive fires?
Yeah, I think especially if it's a managed fire, which tend to be pretty cool on the burning scale and tend to be pretty rapid. If they're overwintering or they have a ground nest, they're probably likely to survive. Yeah. But if you are burning in a year, like the danger of burning earlier is removing those. Like if you're burning in the fall before they've gone into their hibernacula, if you burn, you're removing all those flowering resources. And the fall is the most important time of year for bumblebees because those new queens are getting fat enough and getting the resources they need and mating on flowers. And if they don't have those opportunities, even though the entire colony may have had 1,000 workers, if they don't successfully get enough food, mate, and get back in the ground, all of those 1,000 workers went for nothing, right? The colony didn't reproduce. So that's a really sensitive time of year for bumblebees, is that sort of end of the season. And thinking about their life cycle as you're doing land management, I think is really important. And I think that's what that book, at least that's what I tried to talk about in that book I told you about, Conserving Bumblebees. Yes?
So I assume that native bees have evolved with corresponding native plants, but now we have a lot of non-native plants.
Mm-hmm.
Dandelions, all, for example, and
Yeah.
other what we would call invasive species.
Yeah.
So have they adapted then, and what significance are some of these introduced flowering plants significant in their habitat?
I don't know the answers to your questions. They're all great ones, and I think we all have them. Partially because I don't know the answer to your questions, and the fact that native bees evolved with native plants. We encourage people to do restoration with native plants and to use as local native plants as you can, because the other thing with plants is they have their own conservation issues, right? And so if you're taking plants from Idaho and you're planting that were grown in Idaho and you're planting them, let's say in Oregon, right, that has its own issue. Then we're moving genetics all over the country. And so, yeah, we encourage people to use local native plants whenever possible. But I will say that, for those of you that are going to be surveying bumblebees this summer, bumblebees visit native, invasive plants like no tomorrow. I mean, blackberry is a favorite plant that blooms from spring through fall. Like there are flowers on it all year, and bumblebees love it. So I think in cases where, let's say you're a land manager and you're trying to remove an invasive plant species, I think that before you do that, you really need to think about how you're going to replace those flowering resources on the landscape, and do so pretty quickly, ideally, within a season or so, just so you can, those native plants have helped some group of bees build up a population. And if all of a sudden you just remove their food without replacing it, that's going to have its own problems and effects. The bumblebees are not the best sort of native plant poster children. There's a lot of photos on Canada thistle and blackberry and all of those plants. Yeah, there you go. But dandelions do provide resources. There's no reason you should be spraying your lawn to get rid of them. They're especially small little not solitary bees. They just crawl in there and love dandelions. So